in French and Spanish. The main language will be English, but you are welcome to intervene also in French and Spanish. We will also be recording the webinar in French and Spanish so that you can refer to it afterwards. We have got a message to say that the French translation has the audio is a little bit low, so we'll try to look into that. So do keep your comments and questions coming in the chat, and my colleague Ilaria will speak about the logistics in a moment. But before that, let me say a little bit about who is organizing the webinar and what the webinar is all about. Eurodad is the European network of debt and development organizations on debt and development. We are a network of 56 civil society organizations in Europe, and we are organizing this series of webinars together with our partners across the world. In Asia, that is the Asian People's Movement on Debt and Development. In Africa, that is Afrodad, which is the African Debt and Development Network. In Latin America, that is LatinDad, which is also the Latin American Debt and Development Network. And in the United States, that is Jubilee USA. This webinar series has been made possible thanks to the generous support of the European Commission, Bread for the World, the Avena Americas, and the Open Society Foundation. Warm thanks for their support. I'm sure when you registered for the webinar, you were already introduced to a taste of it thanks to the video. As it describes in the video and in the surrounding flyer, the idea of this webinar series is to provide an opportunity for students, activists, citizens, professionals to get a better sense of the current issues, the current concepts, and essentially all the questions that you might ever have had on sovereign debt and never knew who to ask them to. We hope that you will bring them here and we will be able to respond to them. We will try to cater to as diverse a group as possible and ensure that by the end of this series, we will have not only got you interested in the issues that we will be tackling in the series, but also encouraged people to become more involved in the debt movement, which is strong but needs to be strengthened. There needs to be much more voices in the street, in the media, on social media, calling for transformational action right now to address the injustice, particularly around sovereign debt architecture. So with that, I would basically say a very warm welcome and turn to the topics of today's webinar. So as you know, the topic of today's webinar will basically start with an introductory session done by Iolanda Fresnillo. Iolanda is a senior policy and advocacy officer at Eurodad and has over 2 decades of involvement, engagement in social movements at the local, national, and international level. And she has been working in the Spanish organization ODG, the Observatory on Debt and Globalization, as a research consultant before she joined Eurodad. Iolanda will start with a basic introduction, and then she will turn to the current discussions on debt. And then Daniel Munevar, who is also Senior Policy and Advocacy Officer at Eurodad, and previously worked at UNCTAD, the United Nations Conference on Trade and Development, and the Ministries of Finance in Colombia and Greece. Daniel will turn to the specific issue of debt sustainability. So without further ado, I will turn to Iolanda, who will give you a little more information on how the logistics of the webinar today and the webinars in general will follow. Iolanda? Ilaria, sorry, first.
Yeah. Thank you, Jean. No problem. Hello, everyone. Before starting with the webinar, I have just a few remarks on the course in general. And I will share my screen for a minute, and then we're ready to begin with. Okay. So this is the calendar of the whole course. As you can see, we have 7 webinars divided into 2 sessions each. And in order to receive the final certificate of attendance for the whole course, you will need to attend 80% of the course, which means more or less 11 sessions. Then every session is going to be divided into specific moments. They will start with presentations by international experts, followed by some time for a Q&A. Then we will have a quick break, coffee break. You can go and get some stretching and then come back for the second session, which will be also divided into a presentation and Q&A moment. As you can see here on Zoom, you have the Q&A box where you can write your question, and also the chat. In the chat, you can write your comments, interact with each other, and send any documents or what you think it might be relevant. We will be answering what you put in the Q&A box at the end of the presentations. After each event, those who register will receive an email with the materials that were shared during the webinar and some literature and desk research regarding the topic of the webinar. And you can find also on Eurodad YouTube channel the registration, the recording of the video that will be uploaded a few weeks after the official event. For any question, comments, or problem you might have with the course, you can reach me out at my email, which is here on the screen, and I will try to answer as soon as possible. So this was all from my side, and please, Iolanda, when you're ready, it's all yours.
Okay, thank you. Thanks a lot, Jean, for the presentation, and Ilaria, not only for these technical inputs, but also for making sure this project of a comprehensive training was actually a reality. I'm going to share my screen and try this nice thing of me being floating in the presentation. Yeah, it works. So I hope you see the screen now and my head floating around. This first session is going to be basic. I don't know if it's going to be too basic for some, or maybe not too basic, or a bit complicated for others. But we felt we needed a first session covering introduction to several concepts to make sure everyone could follow the whole course. This presentation and all the presentations that the speakers will be using will be available after the sessions. We prefer to share the presentations after the session, so in case there is a specific question, maybe we can add the answer to that presentation, and that is available for everyone afterwards. And I'll start with the most basic, which is what is public debt. After answering the question today, we will see what is the composition of a country's debt, but also what is the composition of public debt, of sovereign debt between different lenders. What is the evolution of world and specifically global South debt in the last years? also basic concepts to understand the indebtedness dynamics. We will introduce some concepts, complicated concepts like publicly guaranteed debt, collateralized debt, concessional lending, and others. And to link with Daniel's session after this one on debt sustainability, I'll speak also a little bit about why sovereign debt is important in relation to human rights and people's well-being. As Ilaria was mentioning, you can type your questions in the Q&A, the questions and answer box, and we will have some time to answer them later. So the first is, what is public debt? The answer is simple. Public debt are external obligations of government and public sector agencies. This is the OECD definition. So it's debt that is owed by public institutions for two external bodies. And these external bodies can be private agents, banks, other public institutions, other governments, and we will go a little bit more in the complexities of this very simple definition. The first is to understand what is the composition of a country's debt. When we say Spain has 300% of its GDP, a debt equivalent to 300% of its GDP, we are referring both to private sector debt and public sector debt, so sovereign debt. This course, the whole series will focus on sovereign debt, which is the orangey part of this graphic you're seeing. But I think it's important to start the series also mentioning the role of the private sector debt. When I mean private sector debt, I mean the debt that families have, the debt that companies, non-financial corporations have, and the debt that financial corporations have. This debt is owed to other financial corporations, to other companies, even to public institutions. As I said, we will not cover that much in this session, but I'll be telling you right away why this is important. We will focus on sovereign debt or public debt. We use the concepts as synonyms. Sovereign debt is the debt of the public sector together with publicly guaranteed private debt. I have one slide to explain this publicly guaranteed private debt, but I think the name explains it all. It's debt that is created by the private sector, but is guaranteed by the government. As I say, I will explain this a little bit more in detail afterwards. Public sector debt is divided between both the general government debt, so your government debt, and it can be your central government, your state or regional government, your local government, your social security institution or fund debt, and some others, central government institutions debt. But there's also other public bodies that are indebted. Public non-financial corporations. So maybe your country has, let's say, a public company to produce electricity. This public company, which is owed by the government, can also have debt. And this debt is part of the public sector debt. So when we say that, again, Spain has a 100% of GDP of debt as a percentage of GDP, it includes the debt of the public companies and also the debt of public financial corporations like the central bank. So this is what is included. So who's borrowing? It can not only it's not only the central government, but also the state, local, and public public companies in the name of that central government. This is important because in some occasions, these other debts, like the ones created by regional, local, or state companies, are not so visible and sometimes they have an important impact on people's lives, or they are hidden and then suddenly come to light and create a debt crisis, as we will see in some examples. What is the big part? So how this debt is distributed globally? The last number we found is from the end of 2020, and this is from the Institute of International Finance, which is a lobby and a group of private finance institutions, private banks, and investment funds. And as you can see, only 30% of the global debt is owned by governments and by public entities. Most of it, 70% of global debt, is owned by the private sector. This is why private sector debt is also important. This private sector debt includes households, includes non-financial corporations, companies, but also the financial sector. When we speak about the debt from the private sector, in many occasions, the financial sector debt is out of the statistics because it tends to inflate the numbers. And this is the evolution. It's important because in the last years, global debt, both from the global south and from the global north, from private and public institutions, has been increasing at a record high path. Only in World War II, there was such an increase of global debt. And this increase has been accelerated by COVID-19 during 2020. So it's an issue that is important both for countries in the global south and for countries in the global north. What to focus on? Why we focus on public debt and not so much on private debt? We tend to focus in public debt because of the direct impacts on human rights, on public services, on development. And we will be explaining the impacts of on sustainable public debt in those public services and people's rights in the following sessions. There's a specific session on human rights, on gender, on climate, and on the sessions explaining the situation in the different regions. We will also identify what are the impacts of public debt. But I think it's important to acknowledge the risks of elevated corporate, household, and financial debt. Because as we know from experience, as recent as 2008, but also previous experiences in Latin America, in Africa, in Asia, when private debt becomes unsustainable, becomes unpayable, and there is a crisis in the private sector because of having too much debt, this private debt suddenly becomes public debt because of bailouts. Not only that, but even the IMF recognized that excess of private debt can systematically turn into higher public debt, even if there's not a crash, if there's not a crisis. This is because of countercyclical government spending trying to compensate for this private sector debt, meaning support, increasing support from the government to the private sector to so this private sector is more able to deal with this private debt. Nonetheless, even when this private debt is very important, we will be focusing on public debt because it is also very, very relevant. What has been the evolution in the last decades? Well, as you can see, there's been an increase of both public debt, but especially in the last years of private debt. This is the numbers for the whole world. But if we look at the difference between global north and global south, we see that in the global north, for instance, private debt is much higher than in the global south. This is also why an institution like a CSO like Eurodad focuses more on public debt, because it's much more relevant for countries in the global south, while private debt, even when it can be a problem with for countries in the global south, it's a global north problem. Let's put it simple. What is the composition of this public debt? Now going into detail on what will be the focus of this whole series of training. First, we can make a division between domestic and external debt. Domestic debt is a debt owned by the public administrations, the public institutions, to other entities, to other agents from the same country, normally in the same currency, not always, but normally in the same currency. So the domestic debt in Brazil is normally in reals. This can be owed to banks, to bondholders, and non-bank financial institutions, and also to other public institutions, like the central bank, for instance. When we campaign, when we work on sovereign debt issues, we normally focus on external debt, because it's the one that is normally nominated in foreign currency, mainly dollars, not only, but mainly dollars. And when there are difficulties to pay this debt, it's much more difficult to develop internal policies to overcome these difficulties. So you're much more dependent on external shocks. You're much more dependent on the role of financial markets, on the role of your creditors outside, of multilateral institutions. This external debt is owed either to other governments, which is what we call bilateral debt, to other multilateral institutions, which include multilateral development banks, but also the International Monetary Fund, and to the private sector. And this is where one of the confusions normally comes. We speak of sovereign debt owed to private institutions, and we normally say private debt to summarize it, which is different from debt from the private sector. I guess this is understandable. This private debt or sovereign debt to the private sector can be owed to bondholders, and I will go into detail of all these concepts after this. It can be owed to banks, and it can be owed to other private creditors, which can include companies, commodity traders, and other private institutions. This is more or less the scheme of what to whom sovereign debt is owed or can be owed. As you can see, public debt is both growing in the global north and in the global south. You will have these graphics, and if you need it for your campaigning or your work, we will be happy to share the data with which we created these graphics as well. If we look at the sovereign debt today in the global south, we can see how private debt has been growing, and especially bondholders' debt. This is debt that has been created by issuing bonds and selling these bonds in financial markets. This is where things get also more complicated. Commercial private debt, or debt to private sector, to commercial banks and other institutions have remained sort of in the same levels throughout the time. The same as debt to bilateral creditors, multilateral creditors, and use of IMF credit. So the increase in the level of sovereign debt in the last year in the global south is mainly due to the increase of debt to bondholders, so issuance of debt in financial markets. Let me just. If we look at the breakdown of this sovereign debt by regions, we can see that it has been growing in almost all regions, but especially in Latin America and the Caribbean and in East Asia Pacific. This doesn't mean that debt is a bigger problem in these regions. So that doesn't become a problem because it grows too much. It becomes a problem because by growing too much, it doesn't allow governments to invest in public services, to invest in development, in economic development, to protect their people, their companies, their small and medium companies, etc. I think it's, yeah. This is where we have to differentiate between debt stock and debt service. Debt stock is the amount of the obligations at a certain moment. So this graphic is on debt stocks. It's how much is owed in each of these years in the lower side of the slide, of the graphic. It can be expressed as an absolute amount, actually in US dollars normally. And this can help us see the evolution, like the graphic I just showed. It's useful to see how it growed in absolute terms. But normally you will see debt stock expressed as a percentage of GDP to see how much this debt supposes to the overall wealth of the economy, of your economy, of a country or of a region. I will also explain this a little bit more afterwards, and probably after the session on debt sustainability, you will also understand a bit more on debt as a percentage of GDP. We also have debt service. Debt service is what is being paid every year or every month, it can be, or expected to be paid in the future at a certain moment. So it includes what is called the amortization of the principal, so the return of the part of the debt that is due at that time, but also the interest payments. It can also be expressed as an absolute amount, or it can be expressed as a relative. It's normally expressed as a relative towards countries' exports, for instance, to see if you have enough income from exports to pay your debt service to external creditors. But we also use, and as CSOs, we tend to use more and more debt service as a percentage of government revenue, because that is what tells you a little bit more about how much impact is this debt payments having in the government's capacity to deliver, to guarantee human rights. I insist that all these concepts will be more explained in more detail afterwards. This is how debt service, so debt payments, have evolved during the last years in the different regions. And you can see there is also a growth in debt service payments. These statistics only get to 2019, and we know in 2020, both debt stocks and debt service is probably increasing. We have data for projections, but we thought it would be better to show the data that is actually confirmed by the World Bank, which is the source of this data. Let's go into more detail on how this debt is created. First, with private creditors, with private lenders, with bondholders. And let me just go here. Who are these bondholders, and how this debt to bondholders is created? Well, when a country wants to cover a deficit or increase their resources, they can issue bonds in the financial markets. And these bonds are sold to investors throughout the world through international financial markets, and this is when it becomes external debt. If they are sold through local financial institutions or through local financial markets, this becomes domestic debt. And these bonds are sold normally through banks, but also through investment funds, through pension funds, or through other financial products. The key actors in this process are normally not the final holders of these bonds, which might be even your family with their pension funds, but institutions that manage these bonds in block. These institutions can be financial, investment funds, or even vulture funds. A very well known is BlackRock, for instance, or JP Morgan. Here you have the image, and this is news from last night, actually, of a campaign that is being promoted by UK CSOs, by UK civil society organizations, to push for private creditors, especially investment funds, to participate in debt cancellation. You can check cancel the debt in Twitter or in Facebook, and you will see some of these actions being taken place right yesterday and today. So at the beginning of 1919, there were already 25 low and lower middle income countries with these kinds of bonds, mostly in Latin America and East Asia Pacific, also in European and Central Asia countries, but bond issuing in South Asia and in Sub-Saharan Africa has been growing, especially since 2013. And it's also one of the keys to understand why debt is growing in these regions. Here you have the breakdown of bond holders represented by these funds in, for instance, for Zambia, in one emission, one Eurobond emission. You can see, I don't know if you can see it, but you can find BlackRock here or JP Morgan, and other well-known banks like HSBC, with UBS Asset Management, with linkages with UBS as a bank. So these are kind of the institutions that manage these bondholders' debt. When we think of debt owed by commercial banks, one of the main ways that banks are nowadays lending to global South countries is through what is known as syndicated loans. This means that one single bank is not responsible for the loan, but they get together with different banks and together promote this loan to governments in the global South. This way the risk is diversified, but also it makes more difficult to identify who to tackle when there is a problem with the project that has been financed, for instance. And there are other private lenders, like commodity traders. Chad, for instance, had a crisis with debt with Glencore because a commodity trader. I'm not going in deep because I'm aware of time and I'm a bit late. Let's go and take a look at public lenders, like the bilateral lenders. Traditionally, when we spoke about bilateral lenders, we focused on what is known as the Paris Club, which is a non-institution, and we have a session on Paris Club, so there will be more detailed information about this. But it's a non-institution that gathers what used to be the main bilateral lenders, so main governments, who lended to global South countries, including the countries you can see listed here: Japan, France, Germany, United States, Brazil, Spain. But since some years ago, a decade ago, or a little bit more, there are non-Paris Club lenders, especially China, who have been lending more and more to global South countries. And China has now become the main lender, the main bilateral lender, especially to low-income countries. Not only China, India, Saudi Arabia, or Kuwait are also important in this new agents, new lenders to global South countries. When we come to lending, we have to distinguish between concessional and non-concessional lending. So these governments, but also multilateral institutions like the World Bank, when they lend, they can lend at market conditions, but also below market conditions. So with lower interest rates and with longer periods for repayment. When these conditions are better than market conditions, is considered concessional lending. And this can be partly reported as official development aid. This is important because when we say, when we focus on how these institutions are creating or are promoting indebtedness in the global South, it's very different to get debt in concessional terms, so with lower interest rates and longer periods to repay that debt, than in market conditions, because it makes it much more difficult to repay non-concessional debt. This is also the distribution of multilateral lending to least developed countries and countries receiving concessional lending by the World Bank, known as IDA countries. And as you can see, the World Bank is the main institution there, the main lender there. But it's worth to have in mind that there are other multilateral institutions like the Asian Development Bank, the African Development Bank, Inter-American Development Bank, and others. On the IMF lending, I added here a link to a very thorough explanation by the Bretton Woods Project. But if there is interest, maybe we can also enter into that in some other session. And finally, what I promised on the publicly backed private loans. So governments, in order to support mobilization of private investment, offer guarantees to private investment or private lending for a project in the private sector, or also within public-private partnerships. This means that when these loans cannot be repaid, or when these projects fail, these loans become public. These debts are usually hidden from the government's national balance, but they have these explicit or sometimes not so explicit government guarantees. It's what they call contingent liabilities. Even the IMF is recognizing that there is a substantial gap, data gap, with these guarantees. And sometimes the level of debt that we think a country has is even higher because of the underestimation of these contingent liabilities and these guarantees from the public sector to the private sector. Another concept that it's important to have in mind is what is called collateralized debt or nature-backed loans. This is lending where loans are secured against existing assets, land, natural resources, oil, gas, or future revenues. A country can promote a loan and say, well, if you cannot pay this loan, I will have access to the revenue of your exports of oil, for instance. This is an increasing form of non-Paris Club and non-traditional private creditors. And it's especially relevant when we think about Chinese lending. There is this estimation that 33% of Chinese loans in Africa are secured, guaranteed by commodities or export of natural resources. which is something also to have in mind. And these operations are usually also very opaque. We don't have a lot of transparency there. Why this is important? This is important because when, this is a very complicated graph, but we just published right before the COVID pandemic was declared. We had just published this report on how public services and human rights were being threatened and are being threatened by this growing debt crisis. So when debt becomes too big, too unsustainable, and Daniel will talk about that, what happens is that government tends to cut spending to public services, both because they don't have resources and they prioritize the debt payments because there is a neoliberal mindset that says that this is the way to do, but also through, for instance, IMF conditionalities. And this impact of increasing debt into public services is actually undermining the possibility of tackling climate emergency, of being compliant with women's rights and gender equality, with human rights, and with SDGs. We will have a session on debt and human rights and gender, and we will go indeed into this scheme. I'm gonna leave because it's quarter two, so I'm gonna leave it there. I'm just gonna show you one last graph, which is debt service to health public spending, which is what kind of show us why debt to GDP sometimes is not such a good indicator. And what measures most is this debt service, is this debt payment, is this debt threatening health public spending? And the graph shows how debt service, debt payments are bigger than health service public expenditure in many regions and countries in the global south. I'll leave it there and let's see if there are many questions.
Thank you very much, Iolanda, for that very rapid bringing everybody up to speed on the basic concepts and the current discussion in relation to sovereign debt. There have been a number of questions that have come through the Q&A. Most have been answered. There have been a couple of questions still on the board. I suppose we could group them into one set of questions specifically on the nature of the kind of the background of different regional debt situations. So on the one hand, a question regarding specifically Latin American and Asian Pacific debt and what explains the particular nature of that increase, and the other asking specifically about the question of debt moratorium specifically for Africa. Could you go into that first of all?
Well, muted. So I'm going to answer the one on the debt moratorium first, and just to remind that we have a session, not next week, not the next session, but the other one afterwards. So in 6 weeks, that will specifically explore the different initiatives for debt relief and debt cancellation. But what was offered by the G20, meaning by bilateral lenders and only by bilateral lenders, both Paris Club and non-Paris Club, last April, was what is called debt service suspension, which covers this debt service. Debt service suspension means that there is no cancellation, so the debt that is owed by the country remains the same. And what happens is during 8 months in 2020, so from May to December in 2020, and for now until June 2021, the countries that apply to this a scheme called DSSI, Debt Service Suspension Initiative, can stop paying their debts, so can stop paying the debt service, but they will have to pay this debt service after a period of grace. So after 2022 in the first cases, and after 2023 in the second cases, and throughout a period of between 2 and 4 years, they will have to repay this debt. So the debt payments are not canceled, are only postponed to later on. Last October, also the G20 approved what is known as the Common Framework for Debt Treatments. This means that the countries, the same countries that could apply to this DSSI initiative, to this debt moratorium, could also apply for what is known as debt restructuring. There's also next session, we will deal with what debt restructuring means in 3 weeks. But in some, this means that these countries can negotiate with their bilateral lenders, but also with their private lenders, not multilateral lenders, they are excluded, reprofiling, that's the technical term. So a change in the conditions of interest rate and especially time to repay the debt. So let's say I have to pay a debt in 5 years and at an interest rate of 5%, then I can negotiate with my lenders. Well, let's say I will pay this in 10 years instead of 5, and instead of 5% interest rate, I will pay 3% of interest rate. This is the kind of negotiation, and this is the kind of deal that they can negotiate in this common framework. In exceptional circumstances, this common framework admits debt cancellation, so debt write-off. Only 3 countries have so far applied to this common framework. 42 countries applied to the DSSI. We still have to see what are the results of this process, but it's definitely far from what we were asking for, which is a substantial debt cancellation for all countries in need, not just for a selection of countries. The other question on Latin America, it's here. What explains this? I'm going to go for the short answer. There could be a long answer, but I think there are several reasons. One is the excess of capital, of money, of financial resources in the global markets. So after the crisis in 2008, both the European Central Bank and the US Treasury have been offering governments in the global north, in Europe and US, lending at a very low interest rate, even negative interest rate. So if markets want to lend, if these investment funds want to lend to a country in in Europe or in the US, they have to do it at this very low interest rate. So there is very little benefit for them. So these investors have been looking for other markets and have been looking at the global south, especially emerging countries like the ones in Latin America or in East Asia, but also in Sub-Saharan Africa, and flooding these countries with access to debt, access to bond emissions. This is one reason. The other reason is that there has been first stagnation and then a decrease in commodity prices. So the income of these countries, and that's especially relevant for export countries dependent on natural resources exports and commodity exports, the revenues in these countries have been reduced because of the decline in the prices of commodity commodity products. And this has been somehow covered by increasing debt. This is a very simplified explanation. There are other reasons that are related to the context in every country. And I would just point out at one additional reason, which is the existence of tax havens and illicit financial flows. So if these countries first are not willing, there's not political willingness to do tax reforms to increase the domestic resource mobilization that is needed, but also there is a coexistence with tax evasion and tax elusion. This means that there's not enough resources to cover country deficits. So there's been an increase of country deficits, meaning that the expenditure is bigger than the revenue, and this is covered by debt. I don't know. I try to go for a simple explanation. I hope it's okay.
Thanks very much. We can dedicate a whole webinar to the issue of north-south flows, but I think you responded very effectively in 5 minutes to those questions, very big questions. We are up for a break. I know that you have been listening very, very patiently, and it's been a very, very interesting hour. Thanks to Iolanda going into the basics of debt and the current situation, particularly due to the COVID-19 crisis, of the kind of the acuteness of the crisis, which was already long building up. We will take a break for a little less than 10 minutes, I would say. We will come back at 5 to 4. Do take a moment to get yourself a refreshment and stretch your legs. While we are on break, we will recast the slide, which will take you to the website slido.com, where we have a word cloud game going on. So I invite you to contribute your words to that word cloud, and we will show the result at the end of the session. We return at 5 past the hour, the next hour, with the next part of the session, which will be an introduction to debt sustainability with Daniel Munevar. Thank you very much, Iolanda, and thank you very much to everybody for being part of this first session of the debt webinar. See you in less than 7 minutes. Bye. If we run out of time in the Q&A segment, And if we don't have a chance to answer your questions, we will take note of them and try to respond to them eventually in writing or in subsequent sessions. So do keep your questions coming. I now turn to Daniel Munevar, who will introduce the basics of the concept of debt sustainability. A lot of questions that have been raised so far also touch upon a number of issues that Daniel will surely introduce in his input in his presentation. So I will turn to Daniel. Daniel, go ahead.
Okay, hello. I'm going to try something which either can work really well or not at all. So fingers crossed. So I'll start my presentation. And I think it's better if you put me on speaker view, because that way it's going to be easier to see the presentation. So first of all, I would like to thank Iolanda and Ilaria, my colleagues at the Eurodad dev team, for putting the entire series together. The presentation by Iolanda was amazing, and Ilaria has done an incredible job putting the whole series together. So just would like to recognize their fantastic work. On that note, I'm going to talk today about debt sustainability, which, you know, it's a bit of a scary topic. It puts a lot of people off, but I'm going to try to put it in a way that is easy to understand, both why is it important that more people engage with it, but also why it's at the end of the day, it's not such a difficult issue to tackle. So the presentation is basically going to be three basic blocks. The first one is, I'm just going to explain what is the concept of debt sustainability. Then in the second block, I'm going to talk about how this concept of debt sustainability is operationalized by the IMF through their debt sustainability analysis. And then in the third part, I'm going to talk about an alternative way to think of debt sustainability analysis. So let's go to the first part. What is debt sustainability? So the easiest way to think about this is just to think in terms of what is the origin of the word sustainability, right? So the etymological origin is from the Latin sustinere, to hold, to maintain. So when you think of that sustainability, the easiest way to think about it is that it's a system that needs to be kept in equilibrium. If it tips on one direction or the other, the system cannot hold, the system cannot maintain itself. So it's all about maintaining a very fine equilibrium. It's not necessarily about debt growing too much or debt growing to basically disappear. It's all about keeping a balance, an equilibrium. So when the IMF looks at this, it looks at this equation, right? And if I was mean and wanted to scare you, I would say, look, this is, I'm going to take you to the math of this. Or I would brought somebody from the IMF to get you through this equation. But there is a much simpler way to understand what is in that equation and how debt dynamics and debt sustainability work in practice. And at the end of the day, when you think about that sustainability, it's simply focusing on three key things. Number one, what is happening with economic growth. Number two, what is happening with interest rate, with the borrowing costs of the public sector in a country. And number three, what is happening with the fiscal balance, what's happening with both revenues and expenditures of a country. And it's the interaction of these three things that bring equilibrium, sustainability, or disequilibrium, unsustainability, to the evolution of public debt. So how this works? So I'm going to show you in a graphic way how these different things interact in terms of finding a balance. So whenever something is on the right, let's say, for example, there is a decrease in the rate of economic growth of a country, there is a decrease in GDP, this leads to an increase in debt. Why? Because debt is repaid from the national income of a country. The more money a country has, the more capacity it has to repay a debt. The less money it has, well, less resources are available to repay its creditors. So usually this puts upward pressure when the rate of economic growth falls or decreases. This puts upward pressure on the debt. On the other hand, things that go on the left, you can think of events that lead to a decrease in the debt to GDP ratio. So there's a higher rate of economic growth. This increases the economic pie and the ability of a country to repay. Something very similar to interest rates, right? So if interest rates increases, that means you have to allocate more resources to pay your to pay the debt. And if interest rates decrease, then you have to allocate less resources, and then this can lead to a decrease in interest rate. Then shifts in the fiscal balance. If, for example, expenditures increase significantly or revenues of the government decrease significantly, this can lead to a debt increase. And if there is an improvement in the fiscal balance, either because revenues have increased or expenditures have decreased, this can lead to a decrease in debt levels. So how these things work in practice? So I'm going to put an example of a country called Latvia, right? So this graphic shows the debt to GDP ratio. So it's just basically the amount of debt that a country has in relation to the size of its economy. So there can be a circumstance where the country has a positive rate of economic growth, has relatively low interest rates, and it can have a fiscal deficit. That means that it's spending more resources than it's collecting via taxes. So if you think of how the system in equilibrium works, the impact that both economic growth and interest rates have on debt levels, it's enough to offset the negative impact of the fiscal deficit. So that explains why debt can remain stable even though the country has a fiscal deficit. So why is this important? Because there are many cases in which having a fiscal deficit does not necessarily lead to an increase in debt levels because these factors offset each other. But let's say that the next year, the country found oil or is starting to deploy natural resources or pass a tax reform, which leads to an improvement in the fiscal balance. So now you have high economic growth, you have a positive fiscal balance, you have low interest rates. What's going to happen to debt is that debt is going to decrease. Now, is a decline in debt levels always good? And the answer to that is that it's not necessary. Why? Because it can be the case that, for example, the improvement in the fiscal balance is associated to a decrease in public investment that is actually undermining the infrastructure of the country. I can give you a really good example. For example, Germany, right? Germany is presented as a champion in fiscal discipline, but they have a growing problem of really low levels of public investment in infrastructure. Which has led, just to give you a recent example, that one of the key reasons where they're experiencing problems rolling out the COVID-19 vaccine is because the communication system of their healthcare system is based in faxes, a technology from the 1980s. So the lesson to be taken here is that lower levels of debt are not necessarily always a good thing if they are linked to low levels of public investment. So then, let's move 1 year forward in time, and now let's say that the position of the government deteriorated significantly because they no longer exhausted the oil fields they found. So it can be that despite that the country still is growing, it still has low interest rate, that the impact of the deterioration of the fiscal balance is large enough that is not causing debt to increase again. And then let's, I put the years there for a reason. Let's say that then we got to the COVID crisis, right? So now the country finds itself in a situation where economic growth has collapsed because of the pandemic. The country is being forced to invest substantial amount of resources in healthcare, in providing support to workers, and that the borrowing costs of these developing countries have increased. So that is causing that the debt levels as a share of GDP are now skyrocketing as a consequence of the crisis. Now, if you look at this picture, it's important to ask yourself, is the increase in debt levels always a bad thing? And you could say, well, let's say in this case, the country is using these resources to protect its population, to protect its workers in the face of a global pandemic. Is this a bad thing? Then the answer would have to be no. Of course, that is what the government of a country has to do. It's all relative to the circumstances in which relative shifts in the volume of debt take place. So now the problem is that let's move forward in time, and now we arrive at 2021. So now you're starting to have a problem, because without changes in the rate of economic growth, without changes in your fiscal balance, or without changes in the borrowing costs that you have, debt is going to continue to increase at an unsustainable rate. And eventually, the creditors of the country are going to realize that the country is not going to have enough resources to pay its debt back. So eventually it's going to default on its debt. And this is where we start getting, we're getting close to the core of what debt sustainability actually means in the context of macroeconomic analysis and in the context of how the IMF operationalizes this. Because you see, there is a very clear problem here. If you start seeing at these three basic elements that dictate the dynamics. Because if you look at it from the perspective of a government, how they can change this situation, you have a big problem, because as a government, you don't have control over the rate of economic growth. So you cannot change how fast you're growing in order to tackle your debt problems. If you're a developing country, you're usually borrowing in euros, in US dollars, and borrowing from external creditors, which means that you have no control over your interest rates. And that means that the only mechanism available to stabilize your debt levels is to shift your fiscal balance. That means to either increase your revenues or lower your expenditures in order to stabilize the evolution of debt. So the way the IMF looks at this is, when he thinks of debt sustainability, when he thinks of the fact that there is nothing that can be done about economic growth, there is nothing that can be done in terms of controlling the interest rates, the only thing that can be done is adjust the fiscal balance. So then it becomes a question of how much adjustment is required in order to ensure that debt goes from here, basically from an unsustainable path to a path of stabilization. So one way I think of this, and that it's a very graphic way to think about it, is debt sustainability as the art of the squeeze, right? If you squeeze a country too much, meaning you put too much pressure in terms of fiscal adjustment to stabilize debt, people will eventually riot. So you cannot do that. But if you do too little, if you put too little pressure in a country, that means that you will need to have a debt restructuring. But if that happens from the perspective of the IMF, you have a problem, because then the people in Wall Street will start calling you and telling you that unless the country pays more money, they are not going to lend them back. And why is this problematic? Because we know historically the IMF has always taken the side of creditors. And that has led that historically, the way the IMF looks at debt sustainability, it always leans on too much fiscal adjustment in order to achieve debt sustainability. So you might say, well, I mean, this is a crazy CSO guy. He has no idea what he's talking about. But This is literally the definition of debt sustainability by the IMF, when they say that public debt can be regarded as sustainable when the primary balance, the fiscal balance of government, needed to at least stabilize debt under a certain scenario, is both economically and politically feasible. So why is this problematic? Because if you think about it, you can think of models that can tell you how much is economically feasible to adjust the fiscal position of a country. Now, I would like to hear anyone that can give me an explanation of what can be considered politically feasible. Because at the end of the day, it's simply a decision of precisely how much you can squeeze a country before people riot. And that is basically the heart of debt sustainability analysis, the way the IMF looks at it. So now we're going to shift to that part of the discussion. So I'm going to give you a very brief history, because I know I have time is running out. So the first model of debt sustainability analysis was created in the 1960s in the context of the Alliance for Progress. So back then, the World Bank, under pressure from the JFK administration in the US, was pursuing a process of massively expanding lending in Latin America in response to the communist threat in the region. And there was an economist, James Saldanha, that looked at what were the conditions necessary to ensure that the loans that were going to be provided by the World Bank were to be paid back by the countries. And basically what the model he developed was just basically highlighting that debt could be sustainable under any circumstance as long as the country was willing to adjust enough to free up resources to pay its creditors. So in an extreme scenario, you could have a circumstance where basically the entire production of an economy could be devoted to paying its creditors, and this could be considered sustainable as long as the country was willing to do it, right? As long as the country was willing that, you know, there was not enough food in the country, not enough schools, not enough hospitals. In the logic, the economic logic of the model, this is considered sustainable as long as the country is willing to adjust. And the problem is that basically this has existed, this notion is at the heart of the model even today. What's interesting is that even though this first model of DSA was created in the 1960s, this didn't enter into the IMF mechanism of lending until the year 2002. And the reason why it took almost 40 years for that to happen was because all throughout the 1980s and until the 1990s, the loans being granted by the IMF were relatively small. But starting in the late 1990s, thanks to financial globalization, the debt problems of developing countries started to scale in size, which meant that every time that the IMF was lending to a country, it was lending more and more resources. So when the IMF saw this, they said, we have a problem, because now we're having countries that are coming and borrowing from us 2,000% their country quota, which means that if they go under, they're not going to be able to pay us back. So we need to make sure that we have a tool that allows us to protect our resources by not lending to countries that are not able to pay back their debts. So it's not that we're doing a favor to them. We're putting in place the system as a mechanism to protect ourselves as a creditor, as a preferred creditor. So then the decision to introduce this mechanism took place in 2002. And starting in 2002, the IMF is required to establish that debt is sustainable before they can lend to a country. And this is called the No More Argentinas rule. Why? Because precisely this took place after the problems that the IMF had with Argentina between 1997 and 2001, where precisely the IMF was lending into an unsustainable situation. So then they say, we don't want any more Argentinas, so we're putting in place this rule to make sure that we don't continue to lend into unsustainable situations, namely a situation where the adjustment required for the country to pay back is so large that they're not going to pay us back, nor anyone else for that matter, right? So then in 2002, the IMF created two separate DSA models. One is called the Low Income Country Debt Sustainability Framework, the LIC DSF, which is for low income countries, which has a series of characteristics, and I'm going to talk to them in a bit. And then there is something else that is called the Sovereign Risk and Debt Sustainability Framework for Market Access Countries. Now, somebody really has to call the IMF and tell them that they need to chill down a little bit with the acronyms because this is getting out of hand. But basically, this thing is for market access countries. Namely, it's the DSA that is used to assess debt sustainability in middle income countries that depend on basic market access to for their credits. So what is the difference between one and the other, right? So in the case of the LIC DSA, the one for low-income countries, it has a module that looks at public debt, and then it has another model that looks at external debt, and as assesses the sustainability of both types of debt. The LIC DSA also includes a risk rating, which means that the IMF tells you what the risk of debt distress of this country is. If it's low, if it's moderate, if it's high, or if the country is already in a situation of debt distress. And also the LIC DSF includes a 30-year horizon. Why is that? Because most low-income countries still substantially depend on concessional lending, either from bilateral lenders or from multilateral lenders. And these are loans that are paid over a period of 30 to 40 years. Whereas most of the bonds up until very recently of middle-income countries are basically 10 to 15-year bonds. Only until very recently, middle-income countries have started to issue bonds with much longer maturities. So now these are the pictures of how the IMF looks at debt sustainability in the case of the LIC DSF and the MAC SR DSF. And as you can see, they're relatively complex, but at its heart, it's just a lot of bells and whistles on top of a very simple thing. They just look at what are the likely scenarios of growth. They look at the likely scenarios of how much it's going to cost the country to borrow. And then they look at what is the capacity of the country to adjust. And then the models that they have basically developed over the last 10 years, what they add is that they compare a country to other countries in similar circumstances. And then they assess, well, we have Argentina, but we also see, for example, that Jamaica was able to adjust. So if Jamaica could do it, then Argentina can as well. That is kind of the gist of the analysis. But at the end of the day, it's just growth, borrowing costs, and the fiscal balance with a ton of bells and whistles on top. But the most important thing that you need to understand about debt sustainability and the IMF is the politics, right? Because at the end of the day, when it comes to debt sustainability, it's not what the model says. It's what the IMF board, composed of all of the member states of the IMF multiplied by their quotas, is what happens. And I'm going to give you 4 concrete examples. First example, Greece in 2010. The staff presented a report which showed that the debt of Greece in 2010 was already unsustainable. And based on the No More Argentinas rule, the IMF was precluded from lending to Greece. What was the problem? That most of the debt owed by Greece was owed to German and French banks. So pressure of EU member states led to that the same day that the IMF approved its first loan to Greece in May of 2010, they also changed the rules so that the IMF could lend onto unsustainable situations. So it's not a matter of having better or worse models. It was a political decision to lend to a country based on the interest of the creditor countries. Then you have Argentina in 2018, similar story. Argentina went back to the markets in 2015, borrowed substantial amounts of money, and found itself into a crisis in 2018. This staff highlighted that the debt of Argentina was sustainable, but not with high probability. And the IMF required a debt reprofiling as part of its lending operation. Why it didn't happen? Because the Trump administration was close to the Macri government, and then they put pressure on the IMF so that the IMF could lend to Argentina without doing anything to private creditors. You go to Egypt in 2020, same story. The IMF look at the debt dynamics, and they said the staff said the debt of Egypt is sustainable, but not with high probability. They need, at the very least, a reprofiling. Pressure from the US and the EU countries led to a situation in which the IMF approved a loan, substantial loan to Egypt, and this is a story that is likely to end bad, because thanks to the IMF loan, Egypt is also borrowing substantial amounts of money from private markets in a situation in which their ability to generate foreign currency is extremely limited. And then the best example, or one of the best examples actually, it's Ecuador. Again, same story. They went into a program in 2018, and then they went into a new program in 2020. The staff look at the situation of the country, and there is a report that says that they found that the debt of Ecuador was actually unsustainable and that needed a deeper restructuring than the one that was actually undertaken in September of 2020. But what happened? Again, the Trump administration put pressure on the IMF to fast track and approve the loan. Why? Because the representative of the Department of Treasury that was in charge of the IMF was also running for the position of presidency of the Inter-American Development Bank. Ecuador voted for the American candidate to become president of the Inter-American Development Bank. The Trump administration rewarded this by putting pressure and ensuring the approval of the loan to the IMF into an unsustainable situation. And then the Minister of Finance of Ecuador became vice president under the Inter-American Development Bank. So that is the politics of IMF lending into unsustainable situations for all of you. It has nothing to do with numbers. It has nothing to do with the dynamics. It's simply whatever the geopolitical interest of the main voting shares in the IMF have. And there is an even worse problem with this, because at the same time that they are willing to lend into an unsustainable situation based on whatever the model says, they are also in a position to dictate to a large number of developing countries what they can and what they cannot do in terms to respond to a pandemic. So we did a report as Eurodad in October of last year, and we found that for 76 countries out of the 81 for which the IMF lent money in 2020, the IMF found that debt was sustainable according to the IMF DSA. But once you start thinking about what's behind that, there is a very troublesome picture, because out of those 76 countries, we found that in at least 30 countries, as a result of the impact of debt in the context of the pandemic, by 2023, at least 30 countries are going to be spending an equal amount of resources in additional debt service than they were able to spend to respond to the pandemic in 2020. Now, stop for a second and think about that countries spent on average, developing countries spent on average around 2% of their economy responding to COVID. Starting in 2023, at least 30 countries are going to have to pay at least an equal amount of resources in additional debt service for the rest of the decade. So basically, they're going to be paying almost 7 times more than they were able to invest to protect their population. As part of a new report that we hope to publish soon, we found that precisely because of the impact of the pandemic, the recommendations of the IMF is that countries have to adjust their fiscal balance to stabilize debt. And we found that in at least 70 countries, expenditure, including interest, are expected to fall below pre-crisis levels by 2023. So we are, in the name of that sustainability, we're going to enter into an unprecedented wave of austerity. And what is more concerning is that precisely this wave of austerity is taking place in a context in which today, when these expenditure cuts have not materialized yet, where today at least 62 developing countries, debt service is already taking a higher share of resources than healthcare expenditure. Now, is this sustainable? And this goes to back to the question of how much to squeeze. And what we're seeing is an unprecedented squeeze in the name of protecting the private creditors of developing countries. And this is it's simply unconscionable given the scale at which this is being done. So it's important to see that I'm going to rush through the last slides, is that at the end of the day, the IMF, it's a political institution because the decisions are taken on the base of politics. It's not about models. It's simply pure, dirty global geopolitics. But they do this with a technocratic facade, where we have all of these complex models of analysis, et cetera, et cetera. And the DSA, it's fascinating to study it because it's a central part of this dichotomy, where for the rest of the world, they say, look, we take our decisions based on what our best knowledge of the situation is. But once you actually see what happens, is that the models have nothing to do with it. And politics has basically everything that has to do with it. So if that's the case, given that politics is at the core of it, then how we can take off an alternative DSA? So instead of thinking, how much should a developing country adjust to pay its creditors, it should be the other way around. It should be, let's look at how much resources does a country need to satisfy the basic rights of its population in the context of the SDGs, and then how much resources are left to pay the creditors. In other words, prioritize the rights and needs of the local population or creditor rights. So this is part of a work I did for UNCTAD, and that was based on a definition proposed by Kofi Annan, the Secretary General of the UN back then in 2005. I don't have time to explain this, but just to conclude that the takeaways of this presentation is that that when thinking about debt sustainability, just the only thing that you need to look at is what is the relationship between growth, interest rate, and fiscal balance. If you look what is happening with those three things, you will immediately figure out what is happening with the evolution of debt and whether it is sustainable or not. And when you think about the IMF DSA, the first thing that you need to think is, okay, the IMF is lending to this country. What are the board politics that are taking place there? What are the interests of the board members of the IMF by lending or not lending to a country? And then that will help you to understand how realistic the adjustment is. Because what ends up happening is that if you're friends of the board, they are happy to lend you and assume adjustments that are basically impossible to achieve, and in which the ones that end up paying the bill of this dirty politics is the populations of countries that are subjected to brutal adjustments that everybody that takes the decisions are well aware have very little chance of succeeding. So thanks. If you have any comments or questions, that's my email, and I'm happy to take questions. Thanks.
Thanks so much, Daniel. And I realize that for a lot of people, this is a steep learning curve into a very technical issue. But as you point out, there is a technical veneer to a very geopolitical issue, finally. And even though the IMF says it sticks by the rules, it is the one that makes the rules that it is sticking to. And what it finally boils down to is who's setting the rules. And we are going to be talking about the question of who's setting the rules and why that needs to change throughout this series. So I do invite you with that to continue to join the rest of the discussions through the series. Going to the questions, there are a number of questions that have come in. Maybe we can start with the question of where does all this data come from, and how come it's not accessible to the public? How do we know, for example, what is the reason why Ecuador was granted its loans and how come it never gets out into the public. Maybe you can talk about that and about the call for more transparency in these kind of discussions, Daniel.
Yeah, so when it comes to data, this is very problematic. Why? Because usually the IMF only publishes its data after they have made a decision to lend to a country. So it is quite interesting because if you basically see the statements of the IMF, basically over the last decade, they say we have become a more transparent or organization. But that is not, in fact, the case. And I can give you examples, right? So let's say Ecuador goes to the IMF and asks for resources. The process between a country asking the IMF for resources and the IMF effectively lending them, it takes anywhere between 3 to 6 months. Throughout this time, the discussions and the exchange of information between the country and the IMF is secret. None of these exchanges reach the public. The public only learns of the final decision once the staff presents the final paper with all of the data to the board, and then the board decides, and then they publish the decision afterwards. But what's interesting is that it takes 5 years for the IMF to publish the discussions of the board. I've been working for several years on a paper on Greece, and it is crazy that we are in 2021 and still the documents of the discussions of the board of the IMF between 2010 and 2015 for Greece are not available to the public. So that tells you everything you need to know about the lack of transparency of the IMF when it comes to providing loans to countries. And this is an area that it's key to put pressure on the IMF to change its practices, because at the end of the day, the resources being lent by the IMF are public resources, and there should be full disclosure on how these resources are being used, especially because in all of these cases, when the IMF is lending onto unsustainable situation, is effectively bailing out private creditors and saddling the losses to the citizens of the country.
Daniel, there is a question that has come into the chat rather than the Q&A, but I will read it out to you. And it is, how realistic is it to expect to reform the governance of the IMF?
Well, this is a fascinating question, because at the end of the day, the IMF, it's not a private institution. The IMF has shareholders that are member states from all of the countries of the world. It's simply the lack of political will, especially of the key shareholders that include the US, which holds a veto power, and the European Union, which together holds something around 20% of the voting shares of the IMF. So the issue of changing the governance of the IMF, it simply comes down to political will. And I can give you a very clear example. Right now, one of the biggest topics of discussions in the context of the COVID crisis is the possibility to approve a large issuance of special drawing rights. Special drawing rights, it's a currency that is issued by the IMF. And it's a mechanism that can provide liquidity without any cost to all of the countries of the world. The problem is that for each new SDR that is issued, less than 30 cents would go to developing countries. The rest would go to advanced economies, which is absurd, because ideally you would like that these resources would go to developing countries. And it could be extremely easy for the advanced economies to agree that this needs to change and that all of the resources should be allocated to developing countries. But simply there is not the political will to change how the IMF allocate these resources, which is why it's important to highlight that the IMF is a public institution. And if there is enough pressure at the national level for countries to put pressure on the IMF, this could start changing things. The IMF hasn't changed that much in our 70 years of existence. There is no reason to expect that they would do it now, but we have to fight for change, because again, they are a public institution and they should be held accountable.
Thanks, Daniel. There's a question that has come in on the issue of conditionalities, and the question of conditionalities being embedded with regard to transparency and accountability at the national level, and whether it is easy. And I would actually ask whether it is something that is done by the IMF, or there are other issues which the IMF is more interested in with regard to conditionality.
There are two key issues. First, with regards to transparency, and then with regards to conditionality. On transparency, again, the IMF likes to talk big words about transparency, but when it comes to concrete acts, they deliver very little. And I can give you two basic examples. Last year, 81 countries applied to the IMF for resources. As part of the IMF programs, the IMF had up-to-date access to data on how countries were responding to COVID-19. How much resources were they allocating to education, to healthcare, to worker protection schemes, all of this sort of things. And they initially said, we're collecting this data and we're going to make it public. We have reached out to them to access this data because it's valuable to understand how countries are using the resources that they're getting from the IMF, but also how they are responding to the pandemic. They have said that they cannot share this information. So strike number one. Strike number two, they have said it's very important that we have full transparency when it comes to public debts, because only then we're in a position to tackle the debt crisis. The G20, with the support of the IMF and the OECD, have approved the establishment of a special facility that is going to be hosted by the OECD that will collect all of the data, up-to-date data on debt of countries that are participating in the DSSI. We've learned recently that this database is not going to be public, that it's only going to be accessible by creditors. So it is incredible that the resources of public organizations are being used to set up a database on public debt, but that is not going to be accessible by any citizen in any part of the world, except if you are a financial institution or a creditor of a country. So it is really important to call the IMF on the hypocrisy on this discourse that they do on transparency, where they like to emphasize that everybody else needs to be transparent, but that does not apply to them, neither how they take decisions, nor how they use the data that they receive as part of program design. And when it comes to conditionality, it's also quite a complex issue, because while the key problem, again, is that the rationale behind the conditionality is this process of compression of domestic adjustment to free up resources to meet creditor claims. That is what it's all about. So it's just basically telling countries, look, you cannot afford to keep this many hospitals or this many schools open, and you have to fire X amount of workers in order to free up resources to pay these creditors. And it is extremely questionable that any international organization or donor or foreign creditor has that power over a sovereign country of how to best or not to protect their own citizens. So that is why, as Eurodad, we have advocated over time that all of the lending that takes place, it should be taken at least free of conditionality, and for example, in the case of COVID, should be provided as grants in order to not make the debt crisis worse from what already is.
Thanks very much, Daniel. I'll close the question and answer round, and a warm thanks to you, Daniel, for making a very, very dry, and even though the IMF calls it a technical discussion, a very political discussion, a very lively and current and political presentation. So thanks very much for that. And thank you all for your questions. We will be going into the closing moments now. Before closing, I'd like to invite Ilaria to actually give us the results of the polls that all of you took part in. So thank you very much for taking part in the polls. Ilaria, do give us the results.
Yeah, thank you, Jean. I will add my 2 cents to these excellent presentations, and I will share with you the polls on Slido. Here it is. So the answer to the first one, which country has the most external debt? It was the United States. So many of you guessed that. Then we have which country has the highest national debt to GDP ratio, which is Japan, also correct. Then we have Belgium's national debt per citizen, and that is surprisingly more than 43,000 euros. And finally, the last question, which is taken from Oxfam's recent report about inequality. How many months did it take for the fortunes of the top 1,000 billionaires to return to their pre-pandemic heights? And the answer is 9 months, whereas it was shown that for the poorest, it would take more than a decade. So these were the results of the poll. I just leave it here for now and signal that also in the chat, we were sharing some recommendations tool that you can use and add your suggestions for the future. And please, Jean, if you want to close the sessions, here we are.
Thank you very much, Ilaria. And if we were all sitting together in real time, in a real place, this would be the moment that I would invite everybody to give the speakers a round of applause. So thank you very much, Daniel and Iolanda. But most of all, I would like to say a big thank you to Ilaria for pulling this all together. This has all been your effort, your baby. So congratulations and well done. So a big round of applause to you, and obviously to Iolanda for working together with Ilaria to make this possible. So thank you very much to you, and of course to the whole dream team. So including Daniel, for pulling together this really important, current, and very, very interesting webinar. So a warm thanks to you. I also say thank you to our interpreters who've done a fantastic job over the 2 hours to provide translations into French and Spanish. A warm thanks to all of you for supporting us and ensuring that we can make the session accessible as much as possible. Also, a warm thanks to our partners, Afrodad, LatinDad, APMDD, and Jubilee USA, and our donors for also making this possible. Before I end, I just would like to remind you about what Ilaria mentioned in the beginning, that this is the first of a series of webinars that will continue through March. The next one is on the 31st of March, and there you are. You have information on your screen. It's called Defaults and Restructuring, an overview of debt in Latin America. A lot of you had questions about the issue of Latin American debt situation. We will have a panel of very, very good speakers who will present about Latin American debt. So if you have not yet registered, please do register. I do believe that that was possible when you registered for the this opening session. So a warm welcome and encouragement to join that session and to continue to be part of this debt webinar series, Debt Wednesdays. And at the end of it, if you manage to attend at least, I believe, 80% of it, there will even be a certificate that you can get. So do participate and do keep your questions coming. We have tried to answer most of the questions. Of course, it wasn't possible to answer all of them. We will try to keep an eye on them. Some of these questions will be responded to in the course of the series. I also encourage you to have a look at Eurodad's website. There will be information that you will find there to answer a number of your questions, especially basic information on IFI governance, but also on current discussions. We have a blog, that is very much current and up to date. So I invite you to look at that as well, especially in the coming period as we go into an important season, which is the spring meetings of the international financial institutions, where a lot of these discussions will be coming up. So with that, I will say thank you, a warm thanks to everybody for hanging in there, being part of this, and look forward to seeing you at the next webinar series. Bye-bye.